All right, the next equation we have is y equals -3 sine x plus pi. So transformations, identifying those, we have a reflection over the x-axis. We have the 3, which is a vertical stretch by a factor of 3. And then we have plus pi in here, which is a shift to the left pi units. All right, so central axis, start right there. As I said, always start with your central axis. There is no shift up or down, so the central axis is going to be the x-axis here. That's not going to change. All right, so now let's think about the values that we will have on the x-axis and where we're going to be starting at. All right, so we are shifting to the left pi units. These are the usual x-axis values that we would be plotting at, but because we are shifting to the left pi units, I need to take those off. What we're going to be doing is subtracting pi from each of those values. All right, so if you go with your first one, 0 minus pi will start us at negative pi. Pi over 2 minus pi is negative pi over 2. Pi minus pi is 0. 3 pi over 2 minus pi is the same thing as 3 pi over 2 minus 2 pi over 2, which will give you 1 pi over 2. And then 2 pi minus pi is 1 pi. All right, so let's identify these places on the axis here. All right, so from 0, this would be negative pi over 2 over here. This would be negative pi. This would be pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and so on. So the first value is going to be at the x value of negative pi. Well, the amplitude for this graph is 3. All right, so amplitude means the highest point is going to be 3 units above the central axis. Lowest point will be 3 units below the central axis. Now, your first point for the sine graph is going to start on the central axis. So the first point is going to be right here. Now, normally with the sine graph, we go up to the highest point for the next x value. However, this has a reflection over the x-axis. So instead of going up for the next x value, we're going to go down for the next x value. So instead of being at the highest point, the next value is going to be at the lowest point. And then back to the central axis, highest point, central axis. All right, so drawing a nice smooth curve here would look like this. And again, remember that you could continue plotting points if you wanted to, if you were sketching more values than this. We're just drawing one cycle of this. All right, so our domain, once again, goes negative infinity to infinity, goes forever in both directions. Range falls between -3 and +3 with an amplitude of 3, and the period is still 2 pi. The period is the length of one cycle. If you're going from negative pi to positive 1 pi, that's a distance of 2 pi. So that is our period. The only thing that will change that period is going to be a horizontal stretch or compression. We will not be dealing with that this year. You will bring that in next year. All right, next graph we've got here. So we've got 4 transformations here. We do have a reflection over the x-axis. So once again, instead of going up, you're going to go down to start. We have a vertical stretch by a factor of 2. Then we also have a shift to the right 3 pi over 2. And then we also have a shift up 3 units. All right, so let's say we start our graph with our central axis, which will be up 3 units. All right, so let's go ahead and plot 3 units up. All right, so now let's look at the x-axis values. Well, we are shifting to the right 3 pi over 2, which means these usual values on the x-axis, we're going to be adding 3 pi over 2 to those. All right, so that gives us the first value being at 3 pi over 2. The next one would be 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. And then you're going to have 5 pi over 2. And then 3 pi, and then 7 pi over 2. All right, so let's plot some points here. 1, 2, 3. All right, so the first point we have is pi over 2, and then pi, and then 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, 5 pi over 2, 3 pi, 7 pi over 2, and 4 pi. And they just keep on going forever. All right, so let's plot the first point. All right, so the first point is going to be at an x value of 3 pi over 2. And remember, the sine graph always starts on the central axis. So at 3 pi over 2, you're going to be at the central axis of 3. Now another way you can figure that out is plug 3 pi over 2 in right here. 3 pi over 2 minus 3 pi over 2 is 0. The sine of 0 is 0. Negative 2 times 0 is also 0. And then you have plus 3. So when x is 3 pi over 2, that puts you at a positive 3. So it's just like making a table of values. All right, so normally the sine graph would go up to the highest point for the next point. However, we do have a reflection over the x-axis, so that means instead of going up, you're going to go down. And the amplitude is 2. So that means your lowest point is going to be 2 units below the central axis. And then we come back to the central axis, up to the highest point, and then back to the central axis again. And that's going to be the graph of one cycle. Your domain is going to be negative infinity to infinity. Range falls between positive 1 and 5. Amplitude is 2. And the period is still 2 pi. All right, so now let's move on to some of the cosine graphs on this. So we're going to start out with 4 cosine of x. So 4 being your vertical stretch by a factor of 4. All right, so we're going to plot the usual points here, which are pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. and also starting at 0. All right, so, and then let's think about plugging in points. Let's plug in 0. Well, the cosine of 0 is 1. That gives you 4 times 1, which is 4. So when x is 0, you're going to be at a high point of 4. The x-axis is still the central axis. Remember, with the sine graphs, you always started on the central axis. Cosine is always going to be starting at the high point. And then it's going to come down to the central axis for the next value. So the next value is going to be at pi over 2, comma 0. Now another way you can figure that out is the cosine of pi over 2 is 0, and then 4 times 0 gives you 0. And then you're going to go to the low point, which the low point is going to be at negative 4. Then you're going to be back to the central axis and then your high point. And that's the graph of your cosine function. And once again, if you continued it on, it would continue on in both directions, following that same pattern. Now notice the sine graph and the cosine graph, they look very similar to each other. And in fact, the y equals sine of x and y equals cosine of x, they are the same graph, except one of them is shifted pi over 2 units from the other one. That's the only difference. All right, so if you think about the sine graph, let me just go ahead and show you right here. The sine graph started here and then went up to the highest point, and then went down to the central axis, then to the lowest point, and then back to the central axis again. So really all that we are doing is taking the sine graph and we're shifting it pi over 2 units. That's all it is. Okay, so your domain is still negative infinity to infinity. The range, negative 4 to positive 4, because 4 is your amplitude, and your period is the length of that one cycle, which is from 0 to 2 pi for one cycle, and that is 2 pi. All right, let's look at the next one. We've got 2, which is a vertical stretch by a factor of 2. And then we have this, which is left pi over 2. All right, so central axis is not changing because we're not shifting up or down. So the central axis is going to be the x-axis. And normally we graph 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. But we're shifting to the left pi over 2, so we're actually going to have to go over here also. So if I want to find out what the x values are, I can use this right here. I can just subtract pi over 2 from each of those normal values, which gives you negative pi over 2, which is this point right here. And then we have 0, and then positive pi over 2, pi, and 3 pi over 2. So our graph is going to start over here at negative pi over 2, and it's going to go to 3 pi over 2 for one cycle. That distance is still 2 pi. The amplitude is your 2 right here, so we can go ahead and fill some information in. Domain is always negative infinity and infinity. And if you think about plotting your points here, At negative pi over 2, we don't start on the x-axis for cosine. We start at the high point. All right, so since our amplitude is 2, that is going to be your high point, and your low point will be negative 2. So you're going to be starting up here and then down to the central axis, low point, central axis, high point. And that gives us a range between negative 2 and positive 2. All right, the next one here, we have the negative, which is a reflection over the x-axis. We have this, which is right 3 pi over 2. And then we have this, which is up 5 units. So that tells us right here, our central axis, we're going to have to go up 5 units. All right, so I'm just going to say this is 5 right here, and let's draw a central axis here. All right, so if you notice, what we've got right here is a 1. That is going to be your amplitude. All right, so we're going to have an amplitude of 1. Period is still 2 pi. Domain, negative infinity, infinity still. That's kind of constant. Now, if 5 is our central axis and our amplitude is 1, it means we're going to be going up to 6 and down to 4. That's actually going to tell us what the range for this is. So the range is going to be 2. I'm sorry. The range is going to be from 4 to 6. All right, so let's start out. Cosine. Cosine does not start on the central axis. Cosine normally starts at the high point. The difference here is that we have a reflection over the x-axis. So instead of starting at the high point, the graph is going to start at the low point down here. All right, so we're going to be starting at the low point. Now, the normal x-axis values would be pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, but our graph is being shifted to the right 3 pi over 2. So we need to add 3 pi over 2 to each of these values. And so when we do that, we have pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, 5 pi over 2, 3 pi, 7 pi over 2. All right, so as I mentioned, normally sine starts on the central axis and cosine starts at the high point. Because it is a reflection over the x-axis, we're going to start at the low point. And because our graph is shifted 3 pi over 2 to the right, our low point that we start at is going to be over here. Once you've got that starting point, it's really pretty easy from there. From there, you're going to go to the central axis, then to the high point, back to the central axis, and then to your low point. And sketch it as a curve, not a sharp V. So that's what your curve would look like. All right, so that ends the examples for graphing of sine and cosine. There is one more video if you are curious what the graphs of tangent, secant, cosecant, cotangent look like. I'm going to put out an optional video for those graphs, and you can view those if you are curious what those graphs are going to look like and how to generate those graphs. You're You're not going to be responsible for those this year, but you will be graphing those in great detail next year.